In the last video, I made the claim that, hey, good news, we don't have to configure this at the CLI, we simply are going to log into the UCS GUI and get it done. However, we do need to understand before we jump into the lab and see this in action, the different places that we configure our QoS and how exactly we go about doing that. So in this video, we're going to talk about the system QoS functionality within UCS Manager, as well as QoS policies themselves. Let's take a look. Almost everything we've talked about up until this point is going to be configured within the system QoS settings. The system QoS settings are global configurations, and they exist on the LAN tab and specifically within the LAN cloud underneath the LAN tab. However, they are not configured as part of a service profile or a VNIC configuration or anything like that. And that's because the QoS, when we're talking about global settings, these are being applied to the fabric interconnects. So it doesn't matter which service profile is generating the traffic at this point, that would be QoS policies, which we're going to get to in a few moments. However, system QoS again comes back to the global configuration of our fabric interconnects and how they're going to queue up the traffic. And what we're going to find is that that configuration is performed on a per traffic basis. So when we're talking about traffic classes, remember, we're talking about platinum and gold and silver and such. So what kinds of configurations do we get? Well, first of all, we can enable or disable our traffic classes. Remember, we can use as many of these queues as we want. And so I might say that I want my platinum, and I want my gold, and I want my silver, but I'm not going to use bronze. And so I can get onto bronze and I can simply disable it. At that point, we're not using 8 queues anymore, we're down to 7. And then maybe I'm not going to use fiber channel over Ethernet in this environment, so that would be another queue. Furthermore, we are able to change the class of service settings on any one of these traffic classes. Remember, platinum maps to 5, and gold maps to 4, and silver maps to 2. However, if we decided that we want silver to be 3, and we're going to change fiber channel over Ethernet, then we can do that inside of the system QoS settings. Now, in the last video, we talked about that concept of packet drop. Now remember, packet drop is referring to our ability to drop packets, and therefore, yes, we want this on our standard Ethernet queues. We only want to disable packet drop on our fiber channel over Ethernet queue. Now next we have the concept of wait. Wait is interesting because this is exactly how we're going to manage the bandwidth reservations. However, wait is also relative. As such, I'm not going to specify bandwidth percentages in the settings. I'm also not going to specify raw bits per second. Instead, I'm going to map a wait value to each traffic class, and then UCS will figure out the percentages based on the relative weights. And we're going to see this in action in the next video. Now there's 2 more settings here. First of all, we're going to be able to configure MTU. In most data center situations, we're going to want to enable jumbo frames, which are 9216. Keeping in mind that the default for all of these queues is going to be 1500, with one exception, and that would be fiber channel. Now speaking of which, we do have a couple of keywords we can use in the MTU class. For example, I could actually specify normal. If I type normal into this field, you'd expect that, well, it's going to freak out because this is text and it's expecting a number, but normal actually equals 1500. Likewise, I can type FC in. Fiber channel over Ethernet requires a little bit of extra throughput, and therefore there's a reserved value that is 2240. In fact, if I were to go in and I were to enter 1500 and hit enter, well, UCS is going to change that to the word normal. And likewise, by the way, even if it's not an FCOE queue, I could actually type in 2240 and hit enter, and it will revert it back to this keyword of FC. Now, sort of lastly, it's worth mentioning, we are going to see an option for what we call multicast optimized. This is a legacy option. We cannot support this on 6300 or 6400 hardware, and therefore this option should always be left off. If we were to actually try to apply this to hardware that can't support it, UCS is supposed to clear the setting. However, it's usually best if we just leave it off, knowing that we've built our architecture on a platform that doesn't support it. Now, all of these settings are going to be configured at the global level inside of the system QoS settings. However, we also need to worry about a different situation, and that is, what if I have a server that's connected up through the fabric interconnects, and I want to be able to tag this traffic? The question is, how do I want to tag this? And there are 2 primary options for how we'd go about accomplishing this. The first of which is to allow the host to actually do all of the tagging itself. And there's kind of a problem with this, and that is that we might have a trust issue here because the downstream host could configure its class of service to be something that it's not actually belonging to. We might accidentally or otherwise configure our live migration traffic to be in the platinum queue, and maybe that's not where we want it. The more likely option here is that we're going to want the fabric interconnect to override whatever tag we're getting. That means that even if we get a packet from the downstream server that is tagged, we will override that tag and we will replace it with our own. And now the question is simply, how do we go about configuring this process? And the answer here is via a QoS policy. The QoS policy is going to enable VNIC settings to achieve what we just talked about. There are 2 primary components to a QoS policy. The first of which is a drop down for us to select which class of service we want to assign. And once again, this dropdown is going to refer to the traffic class name, not the COS value itself. So if we want COS of 3, we're going to have to pull down the dropdown and hopefully remember whether we mapped 3 to FCOE or to silver, like we talked about here on the left. Since this policy is going to be applied to a specific VNIC, we're typically going to want to match whatever the role of that VNIC is. If, for example, it was designed for live migration, maybe we want that in the silver class. But again, this isn't a hard set value that I'm recommending. We need to decide where our applications and our different traffic types are going to go as far as traffic class is concerned. Now, the next part of the policy is going to be what's known as host control. Host control has 2 different options. We have full as an option. Full means that we are going to trust whatever is sent to us, meaning that if that downstream host sends me a packet that's tagged with a COS value of 5, then I'm going to place it in the appropriate queue. However, I imagine in most cases we are going to select none. None says no trust. We are going to do the overriding thing right here. We're going to replace whatever tag comes in with the tag that we specified in step 1. Now, it's worth noting, by the way, that as a third option, we can actually configure the rate as well as the burst. However, we better be very careful with this option because we might accidentally rate limit a lot of traffic that we didn't intend to rate limit. Either way, to be clear, once we've configured this QoS policy, we can go out to a VNIC, and as part of the VNIC creation process, we can select a QoS policy. So once again, a VNIC that's designed for management will receive one type of QoS policy, but a VNIC designed for iSCSI or for live migration, well, that's going to get a different QoS policy altogether. So we are going to jump into the lab in the next video to see this in action, but for now, let's keep a few things in mind. First of all, any global or Fabric Interconnect related configuration is going to go into the system QoS settings. That would include things like defining which queues we're using, as well as the bandwidth reservations and such. However, when it comes to applying a specific tag to a specific VNIC in our environment, well, that's going to be a QoS policy. The QoS policy is going to be created. Remember, we pick which option we want, and we pick from a traffic class perspective, and we also decide whether we want to trust the downstream host. And again, in most situations, in my experience, we're not going to trust the host, but you have to decide what's best for your environment, decide for sure how you want to do that, and whose responsibility it is for making sure that the downstream host is sending the right queue or the right tag in the case that we do decide to trust it. I hope this has been informative for you. I'd like to thank you for viewing.